Hey guys! Okay, we're back with our last read aloud. I can't believe the time has already come that it's the end of my internship, and this is the last read aloud I'm doing with you guys. But that is not the end of me helping you guys or the end of you guys being able to come to me with anything. Remember, I'm always here for you guys if you need me. Alright, let's get started with our read aloud. So this read aloud is called Endurance on the Ice. That's what our book is called today. Again, I used Reading A through Z, and that's a website you can go to. And look, I made this book. I printed it out and I was able to make it. I bent it and then I stapled it right here. So you can do that too. Anytime you want, you can look for any book about any topic that you enjoy or that interests you, and you can make your own book. You could do a read aloud to, if you have any siblings, you could read it to them. You could read it to your parents. That's all I did. I printed it out and I stapled it right here. So let's read it. Let's see what it's about. Think about what it might be. It's called Endurance on the Ice. What could that possibly mean? And here's our picture, our cover picture. Let's read it. So again, it has a focus question, and it says, how did Shackleton's expedition change from an exploration to a story of survival? All right, here we go. Endurance was trapped. In January 1915, the ship had sailed into Antarctic Circle and became stuck in the pack ice. The crew was certain that the ice would eventually break up and allow them to sail on, as it had done for the other ships in the past. They trusted that their leader, the veteran Antarctic explorer Sir Ernest Shackleton, would guide them to safety. However, the ice continued to close in, and the sturdy wooden ship remained caught. Weeks passed, then months. Shackleton and the crew waited for ice to liberate them, and it never did. Now Shackleton and his crew faced a daunting task. They were trapped in the most isolated part of the world. No one back home knew what had happened or where to find them. In a time before satellite communications or long-range radios, there was no way to call for help. If they were going to survive, they were going to have to save themselves. The Imperial Trans-Antarctic Expedition was the brainchild of Sir Ernest Shackleton. The plan was to land Shackleton and his team on the Antarctic coast, where they would travel by dog sled and attempt the first crossing of the continent. This mission belonged to a British tradition of exploration that had helped map and document much of the globe. Antarctica remained one of the least known regions in the world, its harsh conditions requiring extensive supplies, careful planning, and great courage. Shackleton had the courage and was no stranger to the Antarctic. He had made a name for himself during 2 earlier expeditions there. He was a tough but fair leader who never asked anyone to do what he would not do himself, and his men respected him for that. Shackleton had personally chosen Endurance because he was impressed by the ship's stout hull, which was designed to withstand and navigate heavy ice. He had also assembled a hardy and experienced crew. Captain Frank Worsley would prove an expert navigator in the most trying circumstances. Frank Wild, Shackleton's good friend, served as second in command. Other members of the team were likewise skilled and resourceful, essential qualities in a place as unpredictable as Antarctica. In August 1914, Endurance sailed from Great Britain. 4 months later, on December 5, 1914, the ship left its last port on South Georgia Island in the far southern waters of the Atlantic Ocean. Just 2 days after leaving, Endurance encountered pack ice, which surrounded much of the continent. The ship plowed forward, using its engines and strong prow to burst through. Think about what do y'all think Endurance, what is that? That's obviously the what? That's the ship, right? That's what they named the ship. But on January 18, 1915, ice completely enclosed the ship. It was about 160 kilometers from the intended drop-off point, but its destination might as well have been on the moon. The expedition team could not possibly reach the continent from the spot where they were stuck. In addition, unusual storm patterns caused the ice to remain locked around the ship even when it should have been breaking up. Miles and miles of excess ice accumulated between the crew and any possible escape. By February, the men knew there was nothing to do but wait for conditions to change. On board Endurance, The 28 men remained comfortable and in good spirits. It was a strong ship with thick hull. They worked, read, listened to records on a photograph, and organized talent shows inside the ship's warm belly. They had plenty of food and other supplies to last for many months. The crew set their hopes on November, when the ice usually broke up. So they're finding this good out of the bad, right? And here's some pictures. This is them playing soccer, it looks like. And up here, this is all the men on the ship. Endurance did not last that long. In September, pressure ice closed in on the ship. Pressure ice consists of massive ice blocks driven by wind, currents, and storms. It started to squeeze Endurance like a nutcracker. The men on board despaired as the ship gradually tripped onto its side. Its hull slowly bent and cracked and split. The men compared the sounds it made to the moans and wails of dying animal. Can you imagine what that would have sounded like? In late October, the inevitable moment came. Shackleton gave the order to abandon the ship. The crew salvaged a variety of useful supplies. Each man was allowed one set of clothing, plus his parka, 2 pairs of boots, and 2 pairs of mittens to protect against deadly sub-zero temperatures. The men also moved the 3 lifeboats from the ship to the relative safety of the ice. These boats were their only chance of ever getting home. To survive the trip, however, they would need more provisions. Shackleton felt tremendous responsibility to save his men. He planned to lead them across the ice on foot to an emergency catch of supplies for shipwrecked sailors. They set out on November 1st, but didn't get very far. Steep bridges of ice, 2 stories tall, crisscrossed the landscape. The going was exhausting, dangerous, and finally it was impossible. Shackleton called off the march after only 3 kilometers. That was 2 miles. They set up camp on the biggest, most stable ice floe they could reach. In the distance, they could still see the skeleton of their wrecked ship. On November 21st, they watched Endurance disappear beneath the ice. The men retrieved more supplies from their first camp. Then Shackleton ordered another march in late December. Once again, they made little progress. They picked another large ice floe and pitched their tents, calling the site Patience Camp. They now knew they had no choice but to wait for the floating ice pack to convey them to a site where they could launch their boats. From there, they would try to sail to whatever land they could reach. Life at Patience Camp was harsh and unforgiving. Besides the extreme cold and frequent storms, the men had to contend with soggy gear and clothing. Most of the men slept crammed into 5 tents. Baths, and that means 28 men that were on this ship, they were in only 5 tents. That's crazy. Most of the men, baths and clean clothes were out of the question. Despite these conditions, the men knew how to bear hardship. They entertained themselves by playing cards and sharing the few books that they had. One sailor who crafted a simple banjo led the rest in song. Food was always a favorite topic of discussion. Even though they were far from civilization, the men rarely went hungry. They ate 2 meals a day, almost always a calorie-packed stew called hoosh. It was made of crushed biscuits, water, a mix of dried meat, and fat called pemmican, and occasionally fresh seal meat and blubber. Ooh, it's thundering here, I can hear it. Hunting teams had good luck supplementing food stores with sea lions and penguins. Blubber, fat from seals, also served as good cooking fuel. Meanwhile, the ice under them was moving with ocean currents. Captain Worsley took regular sightings using his sextant, a navigational tool that measured the position of stars or to the sun to calculate location. Patience Camp was slowly drifting toward the edge of the pack ice where they hoped to launch the boats. In March 1916, the men began sensing the rise and the fall of ice beneath their feet. By Worsley's calculations, they had traveled more than 3,200 kilometers, which was 2,000 miles, since Endurance had been trapped. They noticed the ice becoming more fragile and prepared the boats in case they had to launch at moment's notice. Finally, on April 9th, a long-awaited moment came, and they launched the boats into an opening in the ice. With some crewmates working the oars and others at bow shoving aside blocks of ice, they drove for open water. Once they were in more open seas, they turned their boats toward Elephant Island. It was uninhabited and far from help, but any solid land improved their chances of survival. Against the nightmare of the stormy Antarctic seas, Shackleton and his men pitted their muscles, minds, and willpower. With boats that lacked engines, their only propulsion came from 2 sets of oars and small sails. During the long, dark nights, the 3 crews worked to stay in sight of each other amid the monstrous waves. What followed was a voyage of agony and intensity. As storms battered the lifeboats with hurricane-force winds and slashing sleet and rain, waves of freezing water crashed over the sides. Frost and ice crystallized on everything and everyone. The crew suffered from seasickness and frostbite. When crew members finished their turns at the oars, they huddled together for warmth. Sleep was all but impossible. Worsley's navigational skills in these conditions proved miraculous. On the 7th day, the high peaks of Elephant Island loomed dead ahead. The exhausted crewmen who had barely slept for 7 days finally made camp on a stretch of narrow, rocky beach. On April 16, 1916, for the first time in 497 days, the crew of Endurance set foot on land. However, they were still far from anywhere they wanted to be. There was no reason any ship would sail near enough to discover them. Someone had to venture on for help. Little more than a week after reaching Elephant Island, Shackleton, Worsley, and 4 others set out against James Caird, one of the lifeboats. Shackleton left Frank Wild in charge of 22 men who waited behind. All their hopes were pinned on Shackleton's dash for help. No one dared think what they would do if he failed. These were all the men. The James Caird was modified for the voyage. The men had raised the sides and stretched a canvas deck across the top for protection against the tumultuous water. They had loaded supplies and hundreds of pounds of rocks into the lifeboat's bottom. The extra weight would help steady the boat in rough water. Their destination was South Georgia Island, the same place they had sailed from nearly a year and a half earlier. To get there, they would have to cross 1,287 kilometers. That was 800 miles. Of the most treacherous seas in the world. So these dangerous waters, that was 800 miles of it. The 6.7 meter, which was 22 feet, craft and its 6-person crew had to battle for every mile. The waves were massive and the weather battered them from every direction. The man working the rudder, usually Shackleton or Worsley, was often the only person with his head above deck so he could see. The others huddled down below, drenched from the steady wash of waves. Teams took turns managing the sails or working a hand pump to keep water from flooding the boat. This thunder is like adding something to our story. Teams took turns. Whoever was off duty attempted to steal moments of sleep near the prow. Several times, sleet and freezing rain layered the boat with ice, adding dangerous weight. Men risked their lives to crawl out onto the deck and chip it loose. Day after day, night after night, the boat plowed on. One night, Shackleton was at the rudder. Glancing back, he saw a line of white in the darkness above him. At first, he thought it was a break in the clouds. Then he watched in terror as the line rose higher. It was the crest of a gigantic rogue wave. He cried out, warning the men to hold on. It came down on them like a giant's fist, flinging in the boat forward. In an instant, the boat was half filled with water. The men bailed with anything they could get in their hands. Ultimately, their desperate efforts saved their lives. After 17 brutal days at sea, they finally caught a glimpse of South Georgia Island, a most welcome sight. Again, Worsley had worked navigational magic in seeking out a small bit of land in the middle of boundless ocean. Beyond exhausted, the 6 men stumbled ashore. Unfortunately, they had landed on the western coast, but the whaling station was on the island's other side. Sailing around the island was ruled too dangerous. Someone would have to hike 35 kilometers, which was 22 miles, for help, a feat easier than said than done. Steep mountain peak iced with glaciers divided South Georgia Island. No one had ever climbed them before. After some days of rest, 3 men set out, Shackleton, Worsley, and Tom Crean. They headed up the slopes and into the glaciers. Rock walls blocked their way and forced them to double back. The ice fields were so steep they had to chop steps into the ice. Slowly, they slogged their way They slogged their way until they reached the ridge of peaks that divided the island. They had just clambered over the ridge when Shackleton realized a different danger was closing in on them. They were on a high slope, night was falling, and the temperature was rapidly dropping. They needed to get a lower elevation or they would freeze to death, and they needed to do it fast. With a little debate, the three men sat down on the snowy slope and linked arms and legs. They pushed off and sped down the mountain on their backs. In less than 2 minutes, they dropped more than 305 meters. As they slid to a halt, the men burst into laughter. Then they rose and continued their trek. The next afternoon, on May 20th, 1916, a trio of filthy bearded men in torn and tattered clothing walked into the whaling station on South Georgia Island, where led to a station's manager. They had been hiking for 36 hours straight. The 22 men back on Elephant Island remained cautiously hopeful. The earliest they expected rescue was in May 1916 if Shackleton had been successful. May came and went, in July and June. As days of August ticked off, the men feared the worst. Still, each day they tramped up to overlook and scan the sea. Each day they slouched back down, disappointed. Look, the rain is coming in, and this is the kind of stuff they would have experienced. Wow, what a coincidence. Then on August 30th, sharp eyes spotted a pillar of smoke on the horizon. The men hurried to get fire burning to signal their location. The Chilean ship Yelcho steamed into view. The men watched as a small boat was lowered over the side, and they soon recognized a familiar figure in the prow. It was Shackleton, calling out to ask how they were. Some of the men wept with relief. Shackleton had led 3 earlier attempts to reach his stranded men. Each time the ships were forced back to dangerous ice or mechanical problems. Determined to rescue his crew, Shackleton pressed on. Now, finally, he had made it back to Elephant Island. 28 men had sailed for Antarctica more than 2 years before. Now all 28 men were going home. Against tremendous odds, a wrecked ship, months in sub-zero temperatures, on treacherous ice, and the crossing of deadly seas in small lifeboats, every single man who set out endurance had survived. It remains one of the greatest survival stories ever lived or told. Wow. And the rain is coming in. Wow, that's crazy. All right, guys, I hope you enjoyed this read aloud. Remember, I'm always here for you to email me if you have questions. Tell me how you like the book, and I hope you guys have a great rest of your week.